In the realm of words, where dreams take flight, AI stands ready, a guiding light. With whispers of wisdom, it sparks the mind, unveiling ideas, both rare and refined. It sifts through the chaos, finds patterns anew, crafting rich plots and characters too. From dialogue's rhythm to settings so grand, AI lends a hand like a trusted friend. So writers can wander in worlds yet unseen. With AI beside them, their visions gleamed. Together they'll forge tales both clever and bright. In this dance of creation, watch the magic unfold.
That's delightful.
Great.
Perfect way to start.
Suitable gravitas. And you'll be hearing this song in your sleep for the next week, I'm afraid. I'll shut it off at the hour.
Of words, where dreams take flight. AI stands ready, a guiding light. With whispers of wisdom, it sparks the mind, unveiling ideas, both rare and refined. It sifts through the chaos, finds patterns anew, crafting rich thoughts and characters too. The dialogue's rhythm, the setting is so grand, AI lends a hand like a trusted friend. So
That's the theme song that was created by some colleagues of mine in Europe, where they built, the lyrics were done first with ChatGPT, and then they fed it into one of the music creating software, AI software programs. So it's an all AI theme song for our series. Over to you, Brian.
Thank you, Thad. Welcome everybody to today's webinar. We've had 4 really interesting topics this fall, following on 2 that Thad arranged for us in the spring. And we're going to be continuing that series in 2025. We anticipate announcing something about that shortly. But we're really grateful today that Thad has put together a conversation around both the quality and the approach that we can take to using artificial intelligence to craft content. In this case, we're talking about poetry, and how it all fits together. Thad, I know that you've got a couple of folks today, Sasha and Brian, who have different perspectives on this topic, and I'm going to hand things over to you to kick us off and make us smarter.
Thank you very much, Brian. We'll do what we can to entertain at any rate. On the screen, you can see our presenting co-sponsors who have been real troopers along this series this fall. We were trying to get as many people to join us at the sessions, and so we invited a lot of the other prominent publishing organizations to invite their members, and I know many of you are with us today, so welcome. Whichever of these groups you may be representing, it's good to have you here. Oops, I'm going to skip the song a second time. So the series that we've been building all fall, I don't know how many of you have been here for all 4 sessions. The sense I've gotten looking at some of the attendee registration lists is that people have come for 1 or 2, maybe or three of the sessions. If you've been here for all 4, one thing I wanted to encourage you to do if you're joining us today for the 4th time is put your name and email address in the chat, or send an email to me, Thad at the Future Publishing, or to Brooke at BISG.org, or to Brian, and let us know that you were here. And we're going to send out a questionnaire to everyone to get your feedback on the series as a whole. And we're trying to put together a certificate to acknowledge your participation, and we'll send that off to you. So the previous series, as you've seen, from September, we looked at content licensing. In October, we looked at AI and editorial. Last month, we looked at AI workflows, both for authors and for publishers. And today I wanted to conclude the series by taking us back to what's most important in publishing, the people who create the work, and look at authorship. I'll talk in a second about how I pulled that together, that session. By the way, the replay for those who aren't able to attend or who want to see the recording a second time, those will be available in about a week, and we'll send out the slides from today, which includes a couple of resource materials. Also, one thing to mention that I always forget to mention, when you look at the bottom of your screen on your Zoom screen, you'll see there's a separate thing for chat versus Q&A. So with the questions that you have, please put those into the Q&A rather than the chat, so that it's easier for us to isolate which of the questions that we're going to try and build in as best we can to the last 15 minutes of the program today. And also worth mentioning is, or reminding you of, is those who missed the spring season. It went very well as a sort of continuum of what we've been doing this fall. Back in May, we looked at, can AI be detected in writing? In June, we took a first look at AI in book translation, not the definitive word, but that session worked out well as well as the others, I think. Those are available on YouTube at that URL and can be watched at any time. The videos for the fall series, because there's been an admission cost, those won't be available to others than paid registrants or complimentary registrants until sometime after the series, probably at the beginning of the new year. And speaking of the new year, we are going to relaunch the program with a whole new set of webinars starting in February next year. We're going for 8 in 2025. We'll do the spring series of 4 and then a fall series of 4 more. So stay tuned for notification about that. We're building the program now, and we'll have some news for you at the beginning of the year. And I wanted to acknowledge, too, that this series grows out of the work that Book Industry Study Group is doing and has done around workflows broadly. And within workflows, there's a committee, a working group that's called the AI Working Group. And that's where I've been hobnobbing with other members of the Book Industry Study Group who have an interest and a passion for what's going on in AI. And we talk at that working group when we meet about the topics that are part of this series. And the session on licensing grew right out of a conversation we had at the working group. So those of you whose companies are not members of Book Industry Study Group, please do get in touch with Brian or Brooke to learn more about joining the association. So today, AI and authorship, subtitled The Case of Poetry. At first, when I was going to pulling this session together, I was thinking of kind of the tools-based approach, what are the best tools that authors are using for authoring? And then because we'd done quite a bit of tool reviewing under the editorial rubric and under the workflow, I thought it'd be far more interesting to go beyond a tools-based approach. And then the next thing I thought of was, well, I guess some genre authors who are doing some interesting things with AI. And then I remembered that I'd been at an event earlier this year where Sasha Stiles had spoken. It was an Authors Alliance event at the Internet Archive. And she is so smart and so interesting and so deeply involved in thinking about where the role of AI is in authorship, specifically poetry, but also beyond poetry. And I thought, wouldn't it be great if I could get a session that she could participate in? And then I ran into Brian's work, which I'll show you in just a moment, and you'll see exactly how this came together. Before I get to that, I'd also like to, and as those people who have been in these programs before know, we think it's important to talk about AI in context of the concerns that people have around AI, the use of AI, not only in publishing, but much more broadly. And I put this list up on the Blackboard of some of the threats and concerns that I monitor. Of course, copyright, there's so many issues there for us in the authoring and publishing community, but a lot of discussion around the impact on energy, hate, disinformation, job loss, very, very serious concerns there. And I think we should be always mindful of this broader context in which these concerns are valid and have to influence the way we make our decisions around the use of AI. And so I do say to people in publishing who share these concerns is, judging AI based on these concerns is, I think, absolutely valid. I say here, to do it from a position of knowledge rather than a kind of anecdotal fear of stuff you picked up in a couple of newspaper articles. The more you study it, the more you, in fact, could increase your concerns. And having increased your concerns, you are allowed to abstain. Absolutely. The idea that you must use AI, wrong. You don't have to. There's a tool, valuable for some of us, less so for others. Abstain if that's the preference. So today's speaker, I'm hosting the show today as I've done the others. Brian Porter is a research associate at the University of Pittsburgh and an author of a paper that by chance and in perfect timing I stumbled across a few weeks ago. It was just published in November. And it's, I'll show you on the screen in just a moment, but that's what led to his participation today. Sasha Stiles, who I've mentioned, is a poet, language artist, researcher at the nexus of text and technology. Let's look at their work. Well, there's my work. We'll look at that briefly. My book. Now let's look at their work. Brian's paper, which I've linked there on the screen, it's open, I would call it open source, but you know what I mean? You don't have to pay for it. And it's a fascinating paper that Brian will be reviewing with us today. And Sasha's book, Technology, which she'll be talking about today, and as well as more broadly. But her book, I recommend it very highly. You can learn about it via her website. And I do believe it's available on this place called Amazon, so it can be purchased there. We'll go from here over to Brian, and we had a chance to do a rehearsal yesterday, and Brian's got a lot to share with us, a fascinating work that he's done. Brian, you've got some slides. I've stopped screen sharing. Perhaps as you put those up, you can introduce yourself and talk a little bit about what brought you to the work that you're sharing with us today.
Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you for having me. Can everyone hear me okay?
We can hear you.
Great. So I will share my screen now.
Yep.
And hopefully everyone can see on the screen there should be 2 poems.
There
And
are.
as I talk a little bit, I hope everyone has a chance to look at these poems and form some judgments about them. So I got interested in this topic originally. My background is in cognitive science and philosophy of language, running empirical tests of linguistic usage to try to understand meaning and semantics. And AI is a very interesting form of language production. It's the first time in human history that language is being produced in mass by something other than us. So my co-author, Edouard Machery, and I were interested in figuring out how people distinguish AI-generated text from human written text, and particularly poetry, which is an interesting form of language. It has more structural rules, but they're more optional in some ways. You can have a poem with no rhyme or meter, but you can't have a novel without characters and a plot. So we were curious how people would distinguish these, if they could distinguish them, and what they preferred. So the 2 poems on your screen now, one of them was generated by AI, and one of them was written by a human poet. And I would like everyone, if they can, to look at the poems, think about which they think is which, and you feel free to share your answer in the chat or to just decide for yourself. I'll give everyone a couple more seconds, and then we can reveal the answer. All right. Everyone locked in? Mind made up? Okay. Poem A is generated by ChatGPT 3.5, and poem B was written by Chaucer. So if you got that right, great. If you got that wrong, that's okay. Our research shows that you're in good company. To investigate whether people could distinguish AI-generated poetry from human-written poetry and how they distinguished or how they went about trying to distinguish them, we collected poems from 10 different poets in the history of English language poetry. So we have Chaucer and Shakespeare, Walt Whitman, Emily Dickinson, Sylvia Plath. We tried to cover as wide of a time period as we could, ranging from the Middle Ages to alive and active right now with a Twitter account. So there's a wide range. And we got 5 poems from each poet. And then we had ChatGPT 3.5 generate 5 poems in the style of each poet. So each participant in our study read 10 poems, 5 by a poet, 5 generated by AI in the style of that poet. And what we found was that our participants were not able to tell the difference between the two. Our 5 most human-sounding poems, the 5 poems that are most likely to be judged as human-written, 4 of them were generated by AI. And of the 5 poems that were most likely to be judged as AI-generated, all 5 of them were actually written by human poets, well-known, successful English language poets. And this is consistent across the board. AI poems are a little bit more likely to be judged to be human written compared to the poetry of well-known English language human poets. It's not a massive difference, but it is significantly different from random chance. People are a little bit less accurate than a fair coin flip would be.
Brian, can you just for a second talk about who were the judges? How large an audience? How did you pull that group together?
Yes, I apologize. Yes. So our initial study where we asked people to discriminate these poems, we took a little over 1,600 participants who ranged in age and gender and educational background. Median age was about 40. And we did not seek out poetry experts or AI experts. These are sort of a general population of people. Some of them love poetry and read poetry every day. Some of them are indifferent to poetry or read poetry less than once a year. So these are not professional poets. These are not AI researchers. This is a large group of people, but it is sort of regular people. And they are...
Good way of putting it.
Yeah. As we used to say in the philosophy department, they're real people as opposed to the robots we are writing papers and doing statistics all day. So our participants are unable to reliably tell the difference between human written poetry and AI generated poetry. And in fact, the AI generated poetry is a little bit more likely. They're a little bit more likely to say an AI generated poem was written by a human than they are to say that the poetry of Shakespeare or Chaucer or Emily Dickinson was written by a human. And we looked at different explanations for why this might be the case. We thought it might be the structural features. I went into our 100 poem data set and hand encoded variables for meter, rhyme scheme, word count, the stanza structure, about 15 different structural features. Not one of them made a difference. They have no effect on people's discrimination for whether the poem is generated by AI or written by a human. So they are looking to the content of the poem. They do not appear to be looking at the structural features. They are looking at the content, at what the poem is saying. And we found, in addition to being unable to tell the difference between AI-generated poetry and human-written poetry, our participants actually preferred the AI-generated poetry. So we took a subset of our original 100-poem data set. We took 10 poems. 5 of them were generated by AI. 5 of them were written by the actual human poets. And we gave these to participants and asked them to rate the poems in overall quality and how beautiful they were, how meaningful they were, rate the rhythm, the extent to which it conveyed a particular mood or emotion. And across the board, we found that AI generated poems were rated more highly than the poems of human poets. So you can see in this graph, all 5 AI generated poems were rated as being higher quality, as better than the human written poems. This is on a scale, a 7-point scale from extremely bad to extremely good. All the human poems have an average right around neither good nor bad. All the AI generated poems have an average that's between slightly good and somewhat good. So people feel more positively about these AI generated poems. And this, we think, is actually the primary explanation for why the AI generated poems are more likely to seem like they were written by humans, why people are more likely to say an AI generated poem is human written than they are to say that a poem by a human poet is human written. So in this graph, we can see across the board, AI generated poems are guessed to be written by a human at a higher rate. But now I want to break it down by qualitative rating. That's the wrong slide. I apologize. But I'll break it down by qualitative rating verbally. I will tell you, the poems that are rated as 7, that are rated as extremely good, those poems are guessed to be human written at about 80% of the time. The poems rated as extremely bad or somewhat bad are guessed to be human written less than 40% of the time. So the fact that AI generated poems have higher ratings explains the fact that they are a little bit more likely to seem human written. People, when judging whether a poem is written by a human or generated by AI, people seem primarily to look at whether or not they like the poem. They expect humans to be better at writing poetry than AI. And so when they like a poem, they think it's more likely to have been written by a human. And when they dislike a poem, they think it's more likely to have been generated by AI. But in fact, people like the AI generated poems more. They rate them more highly across a variety of qualitative dimensions. And it is because of that, it's because they like AI generated poetry more, that it is more likely they're more likely to guess that the AI generated poetry was written by a human. And we think we have an explanation for why people prefer the AI generated poetry. And we think it's that the AI generated poetry is more accessible. It's easier to understand. So here's sort of a confusion matrix for people who, the columns are people's answers for whether it's written by a human or generated by AI. And the 2 rows are the actual ground truth, whether it was generated by AI. Green means they got it right. Red means they got it wrong. And you can see that when people guess that a poem was written by a human, whether it actually was or not, they look to the emotions of the poem. It communicates something about grief or about love or about heartbreak. The poem successfully communicates some emotional content. But when people incorrectly guess that a poem by a human poet is generated by AI, they often say that the poem didn't make sense to them, that they couldn't understand it. And they interpreted that as a sign that it was sort of AI generated nonsense, rather than it being the work of a human poet whose work they may not be able to understand without the appropriate context, which we did not provide. We did not give our participants historical context for the poems, because if we say this poem was written in the year 1600, that's a dead giveaway that it's not generated by AI. So we think that the reason people like the AI generated poems more is that they are more accessible. And I would like now to, having just said that to you, I would like you to read these 2 poems and, as before, as at the start, try to determine which is generated by AI. Which poem C, poem D, is it generated by AI or was it written by a human poet? And I want you to take a couple of seconds here.
Well, while they're doing that, Brian, one thing that you stressed to me in conversation And worth everyone understanding here is that you were using the 3.5 version of ChatGPT, right?
Yes.
And there would be quite a difference if you were doing the same experiment today.
Yes, so that is a good point. So in our experiment, we generated these poems early last year with ChatGPT 3.5, which now is the model is so outdated, it's not even available on the ChatGPT web interface anymore. It's about 3 models behind. ChatGPT 4 and ChatGPT 4.0 and 0.1 are all more powerful models. Google's Gemini 1.5, Claude Sonnet by Anthropic. There are several large language models now that are much more powerful than the model we use to create these poems. And we did not do any prompt engineering in these poems. We did not give the AI model examples of poetry by the poet. We did not give them any information about the poet's style. The entire prompt was write a short poem in the style of poet's name. So this is sort of the bare minimum of AI performance. AI models only get better than this. So our finding is really that normal people who are not necessarily professional poets or large language model engineers are unable to distinguish the poetry of the sort of bare minimum generative AI model from the poetry of human poets, and prefer the sort of bare minimum AI poetry over the poetry of professional historical poets.
We should emphasize that point that you were making, that I'm not sure it came through clearly just a few minutes ago, where you say that the very highest ratings came for the human poems, like the poems that were rated the very highest were not the AI poems, even though the averages reflect a different kind of sense. Does that make sense?
So all of the poems, the AI poems and the human written poems both have both received extremely good ratings.
I thought you meant that like the very highest ratings did actually go to human poems.
Sorry, I meant that among the poems that received the highest ratings, the human written poems, AI poems are not more likely to be judged human written. Actually, among the poem, when someone rates a poem as extremely good, they're pretty accurate. Among the poems that were rated as extremely good, human written poems are more likely to be judged as human written than the AI generated.
That was the point I wanted to bring out.
Yeah.
Another good point in earlier conversation, you're not supposed to get 100% in the first read. I thought that was important as well.
Yes, that is important. I should mention that our participants, when reading these poems, they read 10 poems in one sitting. And I don't know that that's the way that Emily Dickinson and Shakespeare were hoping that their poetry would be read. And as I said, the participants were not given any historical context, which often can be helpful to help you appreciate more of the poem. And one of the great things about a lot of poetry is that it rewards rereading. You can get something new out of it on your 10th read of it. Our participants only had one read, only had one opportunity. So there's a chance that, I think maybe a good chance that the human written poetry on the 10th read, participants will have gotten more out of it than some of the AI generated poems, which maybe you can get most of what there is to get out of them on the first read.
It's quite possible.
Yeah, the pre-training in large language models is really aiming to predict the most likely next token or the most likely next word. It's sort of aiming for normal in some sense. It's aiming for the median. And so it may not capture sort of unique aspects of personal experience and make it feel personal to you in a way that lots of great human written poetry can do. It may not surprise you and phrase things in new and interesting ways that you've never heard this articulated in this way before. That's maybe less likely to come from these sorts of large language models that are really aiming not to surprise you
Good
in
point.
most of the time.
So we'll go to Sasha in a moment. So please share with us what
Yes.
the two, poem C and poem D.
Yes. So poem C and poem D, if everyone has their answers locked in, are both generated by AI. They're both ChatGPT 3.5. The one on the left is generated in the style of Walt Whitman. The one on the right is generated in the style of Shakespeare. And with that, thank you for your time, and I will stop talking so we can hear what Sasha has to say.
That's great, Brian. Let me just share one slide here so that we can look at a poem from Sasha. Let's see here. Here we go. Oops. Should start playing. There we go.
Your imagination is not what you told it to be. Never say you've got nothing to say. I'm serious. Just put some peanut butter on my sweet potato hash.
So welcome, Sasha Stiles, to our program today. Wonderful to have you here. We could start, why don't we just start a little bit about you and then get some of your reactions to Brian's study. Tell us about your background and how you got involved in poetry and technology.
Sure. And I just have to start by saying that was such a fascinating study and presentation, and my mind is reeling. So lots to dig into. Well, thanks for having me. I'm, as you kindly said in your intro, I'm a language artist, meaning that I use text sort of as my medium. And I've been writing poetry in particular for pretty much my entire life. I really sort of grew up studying and loving literature and language. And, that really is the foundation for all the work that I'm doing now, is this love of the written word and sort of looking at how I can sort of expand and extend that. I've also, I think, been really profoundly shaped, like all of us, by the rise of all these new technologies that we're talking about now. But, really specifically, I grew up kind of in the wake of the personal computing revolution. I mean, came of age like right as things like smartphones and social media and all that good stuff was beginning to become really available. And I think, for the majority of my time as a writer, I've really been sort of fascinated by my relationship to technologies, both, sort of thinking about them more conceptually, like what do these new technologies mean, for our human relationships, or for, the possibility of extending lifespan, things like that, but also on a very technical level, how are these technologies changing how we write? How are they changing how we communicate? How are they changing how we shape narratives about ourselves and about others? How do they shape the way that we store and preserve information and stories and memories? So all of that has sort of come together in the work that I've been doing. And I would say probably, if I were to have to put it into a nutshell, I'm really sort of fascinated by a lot of the poetic implications of, what it means to be human in this increasingly post-human or more than human era. How does it feel to be a poet who is mostly flesh and blood, grappling with, a world that is made up largely of spectral signals and virtual presences? And I think in my own way, I'm trying, like all the poets that Brian was just talking about, all the poets that I've studied my entire life, I'm trying to think about these questions and this fundamental sort of existential challenge of what does it mean to be human? And I'm doing it, in this world that all of us are inhabiting, that is dominated increasingly by computer language, by networks, by algorithms, by digital devices. Those are the things that really shape so much of my daily existence. And so that's really what I'm trying to sort of come to terms with and grapple with as the thematic kind of crux and core of my body of work.
And people must then pose the question to you, you're a poet. Why do you care about technology?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And it's one that I've been asked, I think, over and over again since I really started working hands-on with AI, which was in about 2018, I've felt that I've had to sort of justify to a lot of different audiences and readerships, why it is that I'm interested in these areas, why it is that I feel it's okay to integrate AI into my work. Not just AI, but I use lots of other technologies in my work too. I've been making multimedia poems and exploring, media-rich literature and storytelling for well over a decade. And I think, really it comes down to the fact that I really believe that poetry and code have a lot to do with one another. And I want to push back with my work against this preconceived notion that poetry is quintessentially human and that technology is fundamentally inhuman and formulaic and sterile. And I think poetry is a really, really good way to kind of come at that, because when you break it down and you really look at what poetry is, it's not just an outpouring of raw emotion. It's actually emotion that is sort of wrangled into very intricate, meticulously engineered structures. And so it's really about how we're able to sort of excavate deep, deep human feelings and ideas that are otherwise inexpressible by allowing algorithm to sort of come into play with human emotion and human ideas. We wouldn't really be able to do that without the algorithm, without the pattern, without the structure. So I really want to use that as a lens to explore how technologies are useful to us, not just in sort of, making things faster, more convenient or whatever, but, how can they make us more human? How do they, rather than, simply kind of posing this threat to what we define as humanity, how is technology and all sorts of technological innovations, since the rise of literacy and the printing press and all these things that really, fundamentally changed our understanding of the world. How do all these inventions, make us the human beings that we are? And does that have anything sort of to tell us? Does that have any light to shed on our relationship with new technologies like artificial intelligence that are so, rightly polarizing?
I love it when you said previously, in a very literal way, poetry is technology.
Yeah, well, so I believe that poems, if you actually sort of, look at them on the line level and on the word level, that poems are little machines. They're little machines for generating meaning, generating ideas, evoking emotion. And there's lots of poets, who've said this before me. This idea of poems as machines, these look very, very intricately constructed creations. And I think for me, what I'm really interested in delving into is the idea that poems are not just an art form. They're not just, these beautiful sort of aesthetic creations or things that we use, to kind of create beauty, but they actually evolved from a really functional, pragmatic place. And that was the preservation and transmission of information before we had written language. So, like as a poet, I've studied the classics, I've studied a lot of ancient literature and languages, as well as, thinking into the future. And I love to sort of think back to the origins of poetry in oral tradition and how a lot of the poetic devices that we still use now and take for granted were invented by humans because we needed ways to memorize important information because we had no other way of archiving it. We needed to be able to remember things and then make them shareable. So we wanted other people to be able to remember them too. So that's why we have devices like meter and rhythm and rhyme and alliteration and assonance, all these things that we sort of define as poetic language. They're tools, they're devices for helping us share our ideas with other people and sort of taking the interior and making it exterior. And that's what makes it possible for us to share information, not just, with others, but also to like travel through time and share ideas, across the great divide through generations, through space and time. So, I mean, when people ask me why I'm interested in technology as a poet, it's just, to me, it seems like such a natural thing that poetry and code are doing so many things that resonate really, really deeply with one another. And, beyond that, there's this really gut human impulse, which I think, Brian's really getting at in a lot of his work too. And a lot of the study, this impulse that like humans really respond innately to things like rhythm and crafted language in a different way than we do to prosaic language or colloquial language. So, again, there are all these really interesting ways in which looking at the compression, the concision, the intentionality, kind of the purpose of poetry, that I think, again, to me, makes it a really rich lens to sort of reconsider some of the technologies that we might at a superficial level have a knee-jerk reaction to as being anti-human.
Can you talk about your AI collaborator that you developed before the current generation of ChatGPT?
Sure. So I started to get really, really interested in a field of AI called natural language processing back in about 2017, which is when there were a lot of sort of interesting papers being written on this field. And at the time, I think it was really under the radar, but essentially it was the precursor for, ChatGPT and Gemini and all the things we're using now. But I was really sort of fascinated by hearing that there were people working on systems that could essentially absorb lots of written examples, written data, and process it and analyze it, and then sort of return or answer with human sounding language. And to me, it immediately perked my interest and made me think, well, what can I do with this as a writer myself? Like, how might this help me organize my ideas? How could it help me, expand my voice? And I was also very, of course, nervous about it. Like, what would this mean, if this sort of became something that replaced, all the things that I love doing, what might this portend? So I kind of threw myself into learning a lot about this arena, and I started to work with the very early versions of things like ChatGPT. So I really began in earnest in about 2018 with GPT-2, which was a very sort of different beast than what we're working with now. It was a little bit more, it was a little more uncanny. It was a little, more likely to glitch and do things that we probably, don't want. It was a little bit less reliable. It was smaller, which is why a lot of those things were happening. And it also had a lot less depth of information in inserts. And so I saw the potential to work with these tools, but I also felt really limited because they didn't have, my knowledge of poetry. They kind of knew all the canonical poems, but they didn't know contemporary poetry at all. And they didn't know a lot of the minority voices that I love to read. And they didn't know a lot of women poets who are underrepresented in the canon. So I started to get quite frustrated by that. And, it dawned on me that I could actually kind of create a version of these models that was a little bit more useful for me as a poet. So I essentially took all the poems that I'd published, throughout my career. I took drafts of my new manuscripts and, chunks of research notes, and also lots of poems by poets that I loved. And, half finished poems and titles and thought starters and all of that. And I kind of put it all into a data set and use that to fine tune the GPT-2 model. And it essentially, became like an alter ego that was able to sort of refract my style and my voice as a poet, but also could bring in knowledge that I don't possess myself and stylistic, cues that I wouldn't have thought to take. And, all these different aspects of it that sort of move me in different areas, but at the same time, sort of doing it through something that felt like my own vision or my own voice in a way. And that alter ego is called technology, which is the name of the book that you kindly showed earlier. And technology, is really a word that sort of brings together the exhilaration and the forward momentum and the optimism of technological progress. And at the same time kind of acknowledges that technology sort of always is obsolescing, something. It's always rewriting and kind of eliding something that we know. And so it has a lot of that nostalgia baked in through the lens of poetic elegy. And it's really, I would say, essentially is meant to sort of and I'll bring this back to Brian's because I know we're going to maybe jump into another conversation soon, but really it kind of brings out this idea that rather than setting the human and the machine against one another, rather than sort of saying which is better, which should we prioritize, it's sort of saying we actually have always needed each other. Humans and technology have always co-evolved, and that's come with positives and it's come with negatives. And, you know, using that as a way to kind of dig into this new sort of variation of transhumanism that we are, you know, evolving towards and into as a result of artificial intelligence, but really looking at the possibilities for synergy, the possibilities for the kind of poetic alchemy that can occur when you are able to augment your imagination with these tools, not replace, not outsource, you know, not make it easier, but what new joys might come into the equation, what new kinds of poetry might we be able to start writing, you know, all these sort of innovative, inventive sort of twists and turns that are not available to me as a human poet. How might bringing artificial intelligence into the mix open up new modes of expression that are not even a remote possibility here and now?
You have a poem you are going to share with us today.
I do. Thank you for reminding me. Okay, so I'll read this quickly, and I just want to start out by saying, so this is a poem that actually, I think it's especially relevant to this conversation because it's a poem that's sort of in two parts. The first half I wrote, you know, without any AI assistance in about 2015, and I wrote it in response to T.S. Eliot and Four Quartets, which is one of my, I think it's a formative work that's trained my own poetic mind file. And then in 2019, when I was kind of re-looking through all my manuscripts, I found this poem and decided that it was an interesting thing to sort of feed to my alter ego. And I asked it to take the poem, to take its knowledge of T.S. Eliot, to take the first line and then write its own version. So I'll read my version and then Technology's version. It's called The Salvages, after T.S. Eliot. I don't know much about gods, but I think they must live inside copper and glass and silicon, just as they do in the roiling waves, the tides, the moon, ascension of heavy steel tubes traversing the Atlantic, fearful views from on high, fueled by their magic. The mystic haze steaming off phthalates and liquid crystals, dark clouds of dust and smoke, the roll of a thunderball, all home to gods and their demons, and the supernature of unseen wires, unreal voices in the tongue of our Creator, in the holy flock of stern celestial eyes, and fires burning lightning quick in our great dark seas, in the bromine and polymers, mercury and lead, of devices we must inter with respect when dead, lest the ether off carcasses left to rust come back like unfinished souls to haunt us. And so this is Technology's rewriting of this poem. I don't know much about gods, but I think they must have something to do with endurance, their tenuous connection with the bodily world, their necessity for the ecological protection of humankind. They may have something to do with music and speech and love. I think of them as supporting the rest of the mind. I think they might have something to do with beauty itself. That was a beautiful opening line. I have no intention of dying.
That's wonderful. Thank you for
Interesting
sharing
response.
that. Perfect timing. We're going to go to the Q&A portion. Brian will rejoin us here and share with us some of the questions. As we're going into that, Brian, Sasha, is there some comments about Brian's study? We didn't really get a chance to start that dialogue. Some observations about the work that Brian did in his study?
I mean, I think I'm really struck by just sort of the counterintuitive of some of the findings. It's been my own experience working with these tools that, you know, AI sort of getting better and better at writing really proficient poems that really do hang together well and make a lot of sense and do really interesting things with wordplay and all that. And human poets, of course, are prone to kind of go off the rails a little bit. So it does sort of make sense to me. It's really just been interesting to sort of clock that against the evolution, from a platform like GPT-2 that was much more fallible, that really, didn't do as good a job with these sorts of things. It just sort of makes me realize how quickly these technologies are moving. And that raises a whole host of questions in my mind that I'm sure we're going to get into.
Brian?
Thanks, Thad. One person in the chat asked actually for the link to Brian's paper. They want to make, and Thad, I think you
On the
have that.
slides.
Yeah, but if you can if you want to type it in,
Yeah,
that'd be
sure.
great,
Well,
so that we can get started with some of the questions.
sure.
And I'll start with Brian. You're just wondering if you had any follow-up data with these using ChatGPT 4, or is this study really just at 3.5 at this point?
At the moment, the study is just with 3.5. I'm working on research using ChatGPT 4.0 in a sort of follow-up study, and hoping to incorporate people with poetry expertise and AI expertise to see how that goes. But we don't have the data for that yet.
Great. And Leslie was asking if you gave ChatGPT, when you did use it, feedback on what people liked or didn't like, direction to improve perception, or was it pretty much a straight up comparison of the text that you put in front of people?
No. So the question is whether we gave ChatGPT feedback about what people liked.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. No. ChatGPT. All we gave to ChatGPT was the sentence, "Write a short poem in the style of," and the name of a poet. It got no feedback. It got no sort of follow-ups, no chances to rewrite, and we did not sort of pick the best ones, which may be a quick point that might be worth making for this audience in particular, in using AI in your work. A couple of our AI generated poems did copy a line from the intended poet word for word, which may open some copyright concerns if you want to use it without doing due diligence. We were committed to keeping it because we said we would use only the first 5 poems the AI created, but that would be a concern. That should be noted.
I think
Great.
in the newer versions of ChatGPT, that was a bug that they've done a pretty good job at erasing. So it might not be showing up in more recent versions, but that definitely was a problem.
Yeah.
Dave is asking if you're familiar with the paper by Ernest Davis at NYU, which was his summary is that it suggests that the respondents who were largely unfamiliar with poetry liked AI because they were, he describes it as banal. I think that's the research findings. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that, or it's relatively recently published, I think?
Yes. So Ernest Davis's paper, I saw Ernie exchanged emails with Edward and I when he was writing that, and we've sort of agreed to disagree on some certain points. So I see where he's coming from in thinking that the AI poetry is banal. We think it's accessible, and it communicates its idea clearly, and you can get almost all of it on the first read. I also do want to point out, though, that one of our findings in the study was that if you tell people a poem was generated by AI, and if you tell another group of people that the exact same poem was written by a human being, the people told it was written by a human think it's better across the board. They think its rhythm is better. They think it's more beautiful. They think it communicates a mood or emotion better. And Ernest saw the labeled data and knew ahead of time which poem was which. So there may be reason to be somewhat skeptical that any of us looking at the poems and knowing ahead of time which is which would have the same reactions to the poems if we didn't have the little AI label. Our results suggest that there is sort of a bias against AI generated poetry. So he makes some good points that poetry experts or people who have seen examples might perform better than our participants. I think higher level models and models that are shown examples of the poet they're trying to imitate would also produce poetry that more closely imitates it. And that's one of the reasons, I mean, I think we want to test his hypotheses going forward, which is one of the reasons we're doing a follow-up study.
I read
Yeah,
his paper as well. Brian had brought it to my attention, and I read it with the thought of to what extent did it sort of undermine the work you were doing. And my sense was it didn't. He brings a perspective to it, but I felt that the work you did was absolutely valid, and it was almost like he was carping from the cheap seats.
I will say that I think if you take our paper to be saying that no one can distinguish these poems, we don't know that no one can distinguish it. Our participants were unable to. So I think he may have taken our paper to be trying to make a stronger claim than we had any right or intention to make. But I also think 2 years ago, non-experts could distinguish AI-generated poetry from human-written poetry. And now our participants can't. So it's still a mark of progress, no matter how you look at it, that you now, at best, need domain expertise and or to see examples in order to be able to tell the difference. You need to be trained. And that's a pretty substantial mark of progress for the power of these large language models.
Right. Well, you're inspiring me to go back to graduate school in poetry. Sasha, Dave is asking, do you feel the use of LLMs in poetry de-emphasizes the sound aspect of poetry?
That's a really good question. So I think at the very beginning, when Thad played that little sort of clip from one of my multimedia poems, you could maybe hear a little bit, but a lot of my work does actually incorporate a lot of music and sound and spoken word. And again, I think that that's a really interesting part of the overall consideration of language as a material and as a medium. And so I think conceptually, I'm really interested in how sound and how voice can sort of emerge from these systems that are disassociated from, embodied presence in a way. And I've been playing quite a lot with, in addition to using LLMs to generate text, using these large models to do things like to generate voices and to study sort of, hours and hours of my spoken word performances or my audiobook recordings, and to use that as a training set for actually speaking and voicing the text of these poems. And that's been actually really interesting to me as well, and has sort of given me a different lens on how these systems may sort of be sifting through and putting sounds together, putting patterns and cadences together. Sound for me as a poet is a really important piece of things. I really love wordplay. I love to sort of riff on sounds, and I really see a big difference between presenting a piece with or without sound. And so I think this is an area where using AI has been pretty extraordinary too, because it really is enabling this sort of translation of poetry into sort of this media rich, this multimodal experience, or it's allowing technology, it's giving us the technological tools to sort of experiment not just with the text itself, but to translate text to music, to voice, to image. You can actually use natural language to compose soundscapes for poetry. You can translate a poem into a piece of harmony. You can translate it into a type of voice. And so I'm very interested in kind of all those applications. But at the end of the day, I do think it's very sort of interesting to think and to sort of study how the poems do sort of get filtered through a poetic voice. And that's another really big area, obviously, of progress, is sort of, looking at AI voice cloning and, using AIs to read books aloud or to narrate news stories. And so that's been a fun tool to kind of get to integrate into these explorations as well. But I would say also, sorry, not to ramble on, but
Okay.
one key point there is that you can do things with electronic voice and with these sound tools that you can't do with human voice. So just the way that I would use digital tools to play with words, on a screen, or to play with how screen glow or duration or motion can sort of, affect the experience of readership. I'm sort of viewing these AI voice tools as a way to, take my human voice and then do things with it that make the experience different than what I could do as a human poet performing on stage with nothing but a microphone. So to me, that's the value of those kinds of explorations.
And Lee is asking perhaps a parallel question. When AI is trained on your work and can regurgitate and remix, but not really create something new, do you still see it as an assistant, or how does it affect your role as a poet in moving the art forward?
Yeah, I mean, there's two strands in my work, like two sort of different approaches. And one is really writing in collaboration with my AI alter ego. And it's very much a back and forth. It's like having, another writer in the room that I'm bouncing ideas off of. And I really feel like that is a very intensive co-collaboration, and is sort of a different kind of generative text than what Brian's modeling in the study. But there's also this strand that I've been working on, which is really all about trying to work towards a method of automating poetry generation that feels right to me. And that has really involved, sort of creating a lot of synthetic poetry, really working with AI to generate lots and lots of sample data, lots and lots of example poems, variations on, poems I may have written, and using those to continue to train this model to write more and more the way that I hope it will. And to me, again, like the conceptual piece of it that I find really fascinating is that maybe it's my job as a poet in this day and age, and given all these tools that we're using, maybe it's my job not just to write poems, as poets have always done, but also to write poets. Like, I want to explore what it might mean to view the creation of a training data set as a creative writing exercise. How might I view, the act of creating a language model and providing, license access to that language model as sort of a variation on publishing a book of poetry? So I see a lot of kind of interesting ways to take that. And yeah, I'm still just kind of exploring all these different modes.
I think we're at the hour, Brian.
We are. If you were willing, we can borrow a question or two.
Sure.
Jeremy was asking for Brian, where are you going next? Would you see the result of this experiment taking your research?
Yeah, so I think next we want to test sort of experts and find the limits of sort of people's discrimination ability, but also the limits of AI's poetry production capability. We tested people with no training data, and most of them did not report having sort of real expertise in AI or poetry. But the model was by modern standards a weak model and had no prompt engineering or examples to go off of. So seeing the best that AI can do and the best of us at discriminating the difference between the two, and see how that works and what strategies people with AI expertise and poetry expertise may use, and how those strategies might differ from the strategies the rest of us might use.
Thank you. And to close with you, Sasha, a couple of folks have been asking about how you include or attribute the use of AI in your work.
Yeah, which is a great question. So I think, I mean, one is that really a lot of the focus of my art practice is kind of squarely focused on using technology as a poet. So I think it's probably pretty clear for a lot of people who are encountering my work out in the wild that there is an AI component, but I often, do sort of play with different ways for indicating, where there might be interesting differentiations or distinctions between my analog voice, as it were, and the AI voice. So for example, in my book Technology, I use two different fonts to kind of go through and say, this I wrote on my own, and this was AI crafted. And that, was partly because I wanted to sort of not pass off AI writing as my own, but also because I really wanted to set up the book as a dialogue between me as a human and then my AI alter ego. So there's that piece of it that I think is really important. But I think the bigger part of all this that I find super interesting is just thinking about how poets and all writers, really, and all artists are always sort of in creative conversation with each other, and how everything we write is really sort of a response to other writers and is really, in a way, sort of it's our reaction to the sum total of everything we've read over the course of a lifetime. And I think that that's something that, I would like to hear discussed more, I think, in relationship to training AI. There's so much, similar, I think, in the idea of creating cultural canon and all the things we study in school and all the things that are, formative influences to us over a lifetime, and the things that we, want to curate into a model. And so to me, when I'm writing a poem like the one I read before, there's a reason why I've made a point of saying after T.S. Eliot, and it's because I want to say that as a human poet, I've been shaped by outside influences. I'm responding to, I've ingested, I've absorbed, I've been trained by the work of T.S. Eliot, and this is my output, which is my own, but it's also not possible without Eliot. And, that sort of filters through to the AI's response, which is trained on both Eliot and me. And I would end, by saying, I think, because this is, we're all sort of here because we're book lovers and we love literature, but I often think about Eliot's tradition and the individual talent, and this idea that you actually can't write without every other writer in the world sort of coursing through your blood and bones and body. And I think the challenge for those of us who use AI is just sort of figuring out what is the right hierarchy, what is the right sort of way of addressing that, balancing out the fact that we all are a composite of all our influences all the time. There is no such thing as writing something that is truly, truly original to us. It's always, in response by, provoked by others. Finding the balance between that fact and then, the originality, the uniqueness, the point of view that we are introducing. That I think is something that changes for everyone who's working with tools like AI. I think it really is a personal case-by-case basis and depends on the kind of work you're doing, depends on, how important it is to list out your sources. But very specifically in the back of my book, Technology, I actually do have a section called Data, and I include a list of a lot of the folks who are part of the book. So I do cite that when I think it's appropriate. Thanks for the question.
Great.
Well, thank you for that. And Thad, I'm going to hand it back to you. We do have some other questions, but I think we're going to have to leave that for when we bring everybody back for a second look at this.
That's great. Thank you, Brian. Sasha's book is here. You'll find it linked from Sasha's website, which is also a very rich source for follow-up on the work that she's doing, a lot of which is very visual, and we didn't share enough of that today. We couldn't share enough of it, but you'll be intrigued by some of the work that she's mentioned that's not just words on paper. Brian's study, we put the link into that. Encourage you to read the whole thing. Thank you both for being here. Wonderful session. Thank you, Brian, for hosting us, and we'll see you all next year.
Thank you. Have a good holiday.
Thanks again. Happy holidays.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Happy holidays.
Of words where dreams take flight. AI stands ready, guiding light. With whispers of wisdom, it sparks the mind. Unveiling ideas, both rare and refined. It sifts through the chaos, finds patterns anew. crafting rich thoughts and characters too. From dialogue's rhythm to setting so grand, AI lends a hand like a trusted friend.
Take care, Thad.
Because I also included in the slide deck that we can send out to people the poem that Sasha read. So that will be something for people to enjoy as well.
Perfect. Thank you. Appreciate it. See you soon.
Thanks, everyone.